one role I think that for the UN, to play is to really bring, national governments to work together, to define some general frameworks, for all the players, to comply, within that system. But that's not enough, because the problem is that many of the AI players are really, major companies. It'd be probably in many different countries. And so I think that indeed companies themselves can also play a very critical role within each national context and so on.
All right, we've all heard of the alignment problem, but what about the regime complex problem? Our guest this week talks about the issues of coordination and just how multifaceted it would have to be in order to govern artificial general intelligence well. And by that, I mean ensure its upsides and do our best to prevent its downsides. Our guest this week is Dean Xue Lan, who is the Distinguished Chair Professor and Dean of the Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University. The analogy is often made that Tsinghua is sort of the MIT of China. As with many of our North American academic leaders in artificial intelligence, Dean Xue Lan is a very big advocate for international coordination around artificial general intelligence and very clearly sees the risks of AGI. We don't talk too much about grand cosmic futures in this particular episode, but he is episode 10 in our AGI Governance series. In this episode, he dives into what he sees as kind of a patchwork of multiple ways that coordination should happen at different strata and levels. I'm going to let him do the talking, of course, but I think you'll find his vision useful. Many times people say, oh, it should be the industry that coordinates. It should be the nation states that directly coordinate. It should be the United Nations that solves all of our problems. Dean, I think, sees a bigger picture that to me was compelling, and I hope you'll enjoy it as well. Without further ado, this is live from a Shanghai interview, Dean Xue Lan, here on The Trajectory. So, Dean Xue Lan, glad to be able to connect.
Yes, I'm pleased.
Yes, a lot to be able to go over here, and I want to talk first about governance. In last year's Wake, you had kind of talked about this idea of the regime complex sort of problem, the fact that AI is clearly dual use. It ties into all elements of society. It's not so easy to sort of put into a box and solve for. Mm-hmm. And you've kind of advocated that really there is no top-down solution to this. It's going to have to involve networks. In the last year of thinking about this, have there been any ideas around solving for that regime complex problem that you think people should think about? So maybe if you don't mind, we could talk about how you define the problem and then what you've been thinking. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I think regime complex is a concept that was used in the, academic research on global governance issue. There are so many sort of very complex, governance issues, such as climate change, like AI governance and so on. And that really does not have a, one regime that governing the operations of it and governing whatever the risks and so on. So you have actually many global institutions and governance regimes that have some, claims on it, and so many of these regimes are trying to, play their role. For example, UN system, right? You have some multilateral, systems, say APEC, right? And also you have some international standards organizations. You have ITU, you have many various, existing institutions that actually are trying to play the role in provide some governance.
Yeah.
So that's, and unfortunately those regimes does not have a kind of a hierarchical relationship. So they're overlapping and sometimes contradicting to each other.
Yeah.
So that actually makes the issue to be, quite complicated. So that's why we need to address that issue.
And you've talked about ways to address that issue of maybe there's some components of industry self-regulation. There's some components of, contingency planning things or organizing bodies or sort of networks that can interact in different ways. when you think about some of the more important ideas for solving for that you hope more leaders will think more about, what comes to mind? Like what seems like it might help square this?
Yeah, I think, of course, out of those, regimes, I think one role I think that for the UN, to play is to really bring, national governments to work together, to define some general frameworks, for all the players, to comply, within that system. So I think that role, is probably can be replaced, and I think that would be extremely useful for us to get onto it. But that's not enough, because the problem is that many of the AI players are really, major companies.
Yeah.
You'd be probably in many different countries, the UN or even to say, okay, you have to do this and that. I think that's probably unlikely going to be effective. And so I think that indeed companies themselves can also play a very critical role within each national context and so on. And here I think that we see, I think you also talked about what has happened over the last year or so.
Yeah.
I think one important and really, interesting idea has, come up, and also there's some, sort of movement. I mean, there's some sort of progress in that. One is that, there are a set of national, AI safety research institutions being built up in different countries. Started with UK AI Safety Institute, and then, of course, many other countries have established. And China has also, established a SNASA, it's an AI Safety Research Institutions Association.
Yeah.
So I think that it's sort of like government supported, but also they themselves have formed a network and began to meet.
Yeah.
And most recently, I think the representatives of those networks have met in Singapore in April, and then had some, major document released in moving forward, having to establish a kind of an international kind of research agenda to push forward on establishing the standards and testing and, and so on. So that's a sort of one progress we see.
Yeah.
The other progress is the company commitments that started in Korea's summit a year ago, and some 17 companies signed up to it, and that was last year, and also in China, China has also had a network of companies that also focus on AI safety, and they also had a set of the commitments that have many Chinese companies signed up. Actually, the two documents were not that much different. And most recently, at this meeting, literally yesterday, that Chinese document was updated. And so yesterday, we had company representatives signed up right on site yesterday here.
So these are all components of traction, and there are different ways of approaching the problem, right? The United Nations is sort of one common glue. We have the companies themselves making commits. Sure. We have the AC network.
Let me say this, first of all. These are all different pieces of the puzzle. I don't think at the moment we have the panacea, one solution that can address everything. Yeah. So I think that to have this kind of UN role and to have the national agreements will be very useful. But of course, national government, they also play the role.
Yeah.
If they do nothing, the company's commitment may not, the company may not, want to sign up these commitments, right? So I think that the national government also need to have some regulations, have some requirements, and then I think that really, in a way, pushes government companies to be willing to sign up the commitment. But of course, there are always good players and bad players, right? The national government regulations are all indeed is pushing for the bad players, to make sure that they are not left out.
Yeah, and there's a lot to unpack in all of these. I want to kind of poke into a few of these if you don't mind, Dean Lan. So, first, the role of the United Nations. I mean, if I just look at, versus 3 years ago, the Secretary General, who does believe in artificial general intelligence risk, which is great. Yeah. He's kind of got that AI council. There's only 3 or so, 4 people in that council that, as far as I can tell, even believe artificial general intelligence would be a near-term consideration. There's many people in that council who just don't even think AGI is a risk remotely. But it's still maybe some progress. Also, we've seen some movement to get artificial general intelligence risk into the UN properly. I think Bengio and Stuart Russell had sort of submitted something to some of the past presidents of the General Assembly around AGI risk.
I was in.
You were in that as well,
in that committee. Yeah.
With Jerome Glenn.
Panel that we submitted our report.
Very important. I was chatting with Jerome since that was just an idea. Yeah. So that's also some degree of progress. It strikes me though that those conversations in that context, we'll work through some of these different elements of the regime complex problem, but just on the UN side, there's a lot of parties in there for whom AGI is just still not really something they think a lot about, right? It's not a real concern. It's like that if signaling safety for children makes them look like good and reasonable people, they'll do that. But really facing squarely loss of control and these other bigger concerns that Bengio and others talk about, it's not what they think about. Yeah. What does it take to make the urgency around UN coordination actually strong? Because when I look in the intergovernmental world and when I visit, I don't feel the tension there. What's that going to take?
Well, I think that takes, first of all, I think a lot of research to really get evidence.
Yeah.
Because at the moment, I think there are evidence, various kind of tangential so the evidence in to see the potential problems of the AI systems, but not, to some experts, that's really already enough. But to some others may not be convincing enough. So one thing is that we have not really done enough research to untangle some of the, AI safety problems. So I think that's probably the first thing we need to do. The second is that I think the UN is doing to convene a scientific panel to get the people with different opinions and to get the most leading experts together to talk about what are the evidence strong enough, whether they're strong enough to show that indeed this kind of risk. Basically, what we're doing, we need to do to have a risk assessment.
Yeah.
And of course, that's challenging, but that's the nature of the problem. There's a lot of uncertainty involved. And so risk and assessment is critical.
Yeah, it seems like, we're going to get into contingency planning because I won't lie to you. I worry sometimes that no matter what charts and graphs you put up, until people get hit with some kind of an implication of the technology, they may not actually feel like there's a lot of urgency. But this sort of brings us, let me go to the ACs as well. So you talked about convening a panel to, discuss levels of risks and trends, assessing risks, sort of having more evidence. ACs somewhat feel similar. I've spoken to some of the Beijing AC, Yi Zheng is obviously, he believes AGI and sort of loss of control are real. Many other folks I've talked to in the ACs, I won't name any countries, they're all very smart people. Sure. But for some of them, general intelligence is just not it's like, this is another tech job and policy job and, protect data for children and, it's things like that. It's banal things. Sure. I don't know if ACs are currently seeing themselves as serving the critical role of knitting together nations for when this stuff becomes super intelligent. Like, do you see that conversation being fostered in that network right now?
Not totally, but I think the AC, has a role in terms of really developing more technically acceptable sort of kind of standards and so on and tools to test various models. And also we have to say that there are different risks. Of course, the kind of risk of AI system out of control, that's probably the worst kind we can think of, right? But there are also other hallucinations. There are other problem
kinds of risks as well.
That the AI system can be used for bad purposes, such as you use that for bio weapons and so on. So those are systems the risks are real, right? So I think AC can also play a role in addressing some of those concerns.
Do you almost feel like, I guess the way I see it, and I'd be interested to see if you feel the same way.
By the way, I think
yes.
I think AC and time I think here I think it's and including companies' commitment. If we use that alone as a sort of governance tools, that probably would not be
sufficient. Yeah. I wouldn't think so either.
I think what we need is but we see them as useful pieces. So we bring that together, so that with AC and with company commitments and so on, I think then gradually they will form a structure. And then we can, we need to take an evolutionary approach, adaptive approach.
I'm interested in what you mean by evolutionary here. This is a good framing.
Yeah. I think that, in a way, I think there are two ways. One way is that you design a comprehensive system. And, it's sort of like a UAC, the AI Act. I think you have put a lot of effort in it and, thinking very thoroughly and thinking about all the implications and then, draft all, the legal, codes. That's one way.
Yeah.
I think that's certainly, probably, I think it's one approach. That probably may fit with the European context well. However, if you look at Chinese approach, it's somewhat more adaptive. China does not start with a comprehensive legal framework. China started with some foundational legal framework, information, Personal Information Protect Act and the Internet Safety Act and so on. So those are foundational for AI development and so on, but not a particular, act on AI. So then I think China, based on, its development and the issues that comes up, and then China began to have various kind of regulations. For example, the generative AI, and there's temporary measures to govern the, the generative AI. And so you have those kind of adaptive approach to develop different pieces of the regulation system.
Yeah, so different regions are taking sort of different approaches. To your point, it does feel very hard to think through all of it and then enact a law. It's like there's so much that's going to bubble up. There's going to be new paradigms of models.
Yeah. Another thing I also wanted to mention that, this AI technology is so different from previously any other technology,
totally.
Right? So when it really gets to into application in different countries have, very different systems, in terms of the context and systems are very different. So in a way, you have to redesign a so-called technical social system to really get the technology be embedded in the society. And that, I think, would, different from one country to another.
Yeah. Well, and it almost makes me I'm going to nutshell what I think you're saying. We're going to talk a bit about contingencies before we wrap up, but I'm going to nutshell what you're saying. These different components of the regime complex problem, they all maybe have a role to fill, and none of them are going to be good enough by itself.
No.
But they all might have a role to fill. Yeah. And I think it sounds like your hope is, maybe the ACs will tackle certain kinds of international agreement or technical assessment of different sorts of things. National governments will sort of support the ACs or maybe support the United Nations potential efforts if we see more there. Company commitments by themselves, I don't think are worth very much, but company commitments backed by a lot of other knitted elements. When all these come together, your thought is those, that kind of community of approaches has to sort of adapt and move with where the tech, the challenges, the developments sort of go to kind of help us steer more in real time. This feels like what you're advocating for. Is this a correct assessment, or would you add anything to that?
I agree. I wanted to pick up one point that you made. You kind of brushed out the company commitments. I wanted to challenge that.
Oh, please do, because I am a little pessimistic about this.
I think there is certainly. I think a lot of people say, "Oh, this is just companies, whitewashing."
Yes.
But the reality is that really, depend how you design the commitment.
Okay, go on.
I think in China, the commitment, it's a process. It's just not, having this kind of a commitment drafted and then signed. You have various kind of a process that, once you sign this, and that's this network that will require you later to disclose your practice. How do you actually implement those commitments? And then there's some other steps to really verify and so on. So I think that's actually
who's supporting who's putting force behind the necessity to share? Is it the government or?
It's not the government. It's kind of an industrial association.
Okay. So right? Among themselves. Okay.
So I think that given that companies compete with one another.
Yes.
So your competitor may actually are taking the lead on this. You don't want to be left out. Right?
Yes.
Probably certainly.
Yeah.
And so they are kind of competing with each other, but also there are external pressure. This general society, people knows about this. So maybe that someday a user say, okay, you're not among those companies signed up on this. So I'm not sure I wanted to use your, product. So there is that role.
Yeah, no, this is good. So I think you're right to draw the distinction. I see what you mean.
Yeah.
So I look at, there's Dan Hendricks is here. He's been on the show before.
Yeah.
They had kind of a safe AI, sort of just a commitment statement. Everybody signed preventing AGI risk is serious, just like preventing nuclear war or bioweapons. And it's sort of like, you just get signatures.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think Hendricks is doing anything wrong, but I think Elon Musk will put his name there and then he'll say, I think there's a 20% chance it kills everybody.
Yeah.
And then he'll throw $20 billion at data centers. And I'm not blaming Elon Musk. I mean, the incentives make it so that everybody's racing. And that's dangerous. But just words alone don't feel that important. But what you're saying is, if it becomes more of an association, I'm interested, what does that look like internationally? Because I look at my own Western world and I see a lot of pretty overt competition, never mind across the world. Could there be a global association?
Well, I think that's a very good, question. I think that as now we see that, there are increasingly more companies signed up. Some of these are international, some of them locally, and hopefully there'll be some coordination, right? I mean, it could be done by some, newly created international organizations, or maybe done by some standard organizations, international standard organizations. And so I think there are indeed, I don't want to add more regime to already complicated situation,
of course.
But I'm sure there are existing venues and mechanisms that can be used.
I see Stuart Russell having an initiative for a lot of track 2 dialogue with academics, right? He's I think you're in that ecosystem.
Yeah, sure.
And so he's fostering this international discourse around AGI with leading academics. I don't know if such a thing exists among the big labs between East and West, but it does feel like that would be necessary.
I think actually this, gets to the point that I think that, of course, without the current geopolitical complexities, in an ideal situation, I think it'd be great to have a kind of international lab on AGI.
Yeah, Bengio's talked about a CERN for AGI.
Exactly, like CERN, like ITER effort, right? So that can save a lot of, efforts on, putting all the minds together to do a great job. Of course, that's unlikely, but maybe let's say on the safety side, is it possible for companies and for many of these, from different countries to work together and try to, develop some, safety technologies to make sure that indeed AI can be safely developed and used.
Yeah, I mean, well, this takes us to contingencies, which we'll close on here. Part of me feels like, and I wish I didn't feel this way, Dylan, but I do. Part of me feels like in order for UN conversations to have teeth, in order for the ACs eventually to start talking about real general intelligence risk, in order for there to be a kind of magnetism
between kind of the East and West to at least agree on some things. I think we have to be struck with the consequences of not doing so, because the risks will always feel abstract.
Yeah.
A trend, it's very hard to extrapolate a trend in the human mind. Generally, people have to feel an impact. I see a lot of contingency situations that I think would actually accelerate this kind of arms race dynamic. Like if there was a AI loss of control incident and somebody, whether it's the US, China, they say, oh, it wasn't us that lost control. We must have been hacked by the bad guys, right? If either side says that and it becomes it could be an accident that accelerates arms race. There's other accidents like a Chernobyl type thing where it's clear nobody intended it and it was dangerous, and now all the parties will come together and try to solve it. But I think half or more of the ways that a disaster could happen with AGI early on might turn into a finger-pointing contest that would not bring about solidarity. What do you think is important to prepare before some sorts of real impacts around civilization start to happen for us to make sure it can become a solidarity opportunity?
I think that, it's, to everybody's imagination. But, I think, I always say that, the risk is always ahead of the human progress.
Yeah.
So I think that one thing that if we learn anything is that we need to prepare for the worst.
Yeah.
So that comes, here, I think contingency plan can be very useful. Basically here that requires us to think about, exactly what you just described. What are some of the potential risky situations, how that might happen, how that might unfold. So if that happens, how can we catch that, process from the very first, sign of the problem, and then see how we can sort of really control that at the early stage. If not, how do we deal with that, in a more useful way, constructive way,
yeah,
to minimize the potential costs.
Yeah, I know that the Rand Corporation recently has started very much thinking about AGI, and part of their brainstorms are what are some of the failure modes that could happen and how should we respond?
Yeah.
It seems like that should already be an international thing. Like, even though China and the US, we both want to be the strongest or whatever, it's sort of, well, if this happened, hypothetically, what could we do together to not make it worse? If this happened, hypothetically, what could we do it feels like this preparing for the worst should almost be a group brainstorm here.
Totally agree. By the way, I wanted to say that actually, there's not a lot of those kind of a U.S. versus China rhetoric in China. I think you are now in this kind of a this meeting last 2 days. People are talking about how actually the technology can be used in various contexts, right?
Totally.
Yeah, and there's also, I think, a lot of talk about how actually the AI can use to benefit other countries. I mean, to generate, broad benefits, to human society. There's not, I think, that kind of a mentality of, okay, we are really in competition with US. I think that rhetoric, I don't know where that come from, certainly, but not from China.
Yeah, I guess it, I imagine there are some people in both nations. I think it would be hard to deny there are some people in both nations who feel that way. But what I will say is, I think when it seems like Trump talks about winning, a lot of it is under the presumption that AI is just another technology for wealth, and it's not really as paradigm shifting as you and I are discussing. I don't think it dawns on Trump exactly right now about the bigger implication. I think it's just like, we're going to be successful in business. I don't think he sees it as creating the robots that conquer the world. But I will say, certainly here, a lot of the conversation's been around solidarity, and I know plenty of people in the Western world who are really excited to make sure this doesn't turn into some sort of global conflict. So it does feel like there's enough people on all the sides to say, okay, if something rough happened, how do we make sure we don't turn it into a blame game and instead get a little bit closer together to solving it?
Totally agree. I think so. So I agree that that's probably is another thing that's sort of kind of why there's a need some international cooperation. At least let's start from the safety side and including this how do we prepare for the worst in case something happens. So I think indeed that's another topic for international collaboration.
So I'll end on this note, I guess, when it comes to a closing note around this contingency planning and planning for the potential emergency stuff that would, unfortunately, in my opinion, potentially be the only things that catalyze the bigger international community to start taking this seriously. It seems like one of the takeaways is we need to prepare for the worst and make it a group exercise of preparing for the worst. Even if we're not going to share everything, can we at least share how to prevent this thing from, collapsing civilization? Are there any other things that you hope happen in the international community to be a kind of a contingency-oriented plan? And anything else there that for you feels like we should do so that something goes wrong, we'll be able to come together in a global way and maybe solve it a bit more? Anything else we should think about?
I think the other thing that needs to be done, I think that's probably may take a long time, is to really, first of all, to have some better communication channels between U.S. and China and many other countries. I think currently, that, there were people say that at the peak of the time, there were several hundreds of communication channels between the two countries, and currently it's so limited. So that's one problem. And the second issue that to be addressed is how do we, through those communication channels, gradually building some trust. I think that's sort of and that's also a really critical piece in order to be able to collaborate.
Yeah, well, it feels like the better communications channels, the way I'm taking that, just to close out, make sure people can understand what you're saying, is like track 1, track 2, just more ways of interfacing.
Exactly.
And the way that I guess trust and that stuff would be built would be this kind of regime complex thing. We'd have the academics have discussion. We'd have the labs maybe have discussion.
Or maybe the U.S. Congress and Chinese Parliament, right?
That could be great too. That's another. It's almost like, again, knitting all the strings together to at least have a touch, right? At least have a touch.
Exactly.
And I will say, I think the language barrier is big. Of course, the international tensions right now between the U.S. and China are big.
Yeah.
But there are enough people that don't want this to go wrong on both sides. It feels like it's possible.
Totally.
So you would say across all these stratum of these civilizations, let's just have lines of comms. Let's talk. Yeah. Huh. Well, I think that's worthwhile take home. I know that's all we have for time, but
well, you're playing that role.
Yeah, I'm crossing my fingers that we can facilitate more of this. But it's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
So that's all for this episode of The Trajectory. A big thank you to Dean Xue Lan, and thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in all the way through to the end of this episode. I want to touch on 2 quick points here to wrap up the episode with Dean Xue Lan. One is that this episode is part of the AGI Governance series, episode 10 to be exact. We've had, Yudkowsky and, countless others, Connor Leahy, a bunch of other voices that I think are smart folks with a lot to contribute to this series. And I hope to have more voices from the other side of the pond. Frankly, I think that fostering kind of open dialogue and conversation is incredibly important. And I somewhat deliberately didn't want to direct my interview with Dean Xue Lan around sort of the tensions or race between the U.S. and China, but more just generally about governance. I suspect we will have folks from China in that series as well. But a lot of what I've read from Dean is dealing with this regime complex problem. And it just felt like it's kind of clear for all of us. Let's just talk about it in terms of governance. So while I am mindful that there are things that maybe can't be said by folks in certain regimes, I'm also mindful that there are smart and well-intended folks living in every possible geography who will have good ideas. And so my goal is to continue to kind of be frank about what I see as the pros and cons of the approaches of both respective regimes, but also gather the best ideas from the smartest people. Of course, the language barrier is real. I wish I could speak Mandarin. But Dean, I thought, did a great job. So very grateful to have him on the General Governance series. Second, he had a bit more optimism than I did around these company commitments. I saw, but he might be tilting my mind here. So you heard him say something like, some of the momentum he's seeing is these companies sort of committing, hey, we'll, like at the safety summit, for example, the Bletchley sort of convention there, the original one, the commitments were sort of made around between the big labs around sort of making sure that this stuff is safe. And, even countries sort of came together and sort of shook hands, at least in a representative way that, okay, we're kind of moving in this direction. I see this just as, okay, well, everybody has to feign virtue whenever they have to feign virtue. Yippity doo dah. This has to turn into something more serious. He sees it maybe as sort of stepping stones to what will become greater coordination. And I think that might be the right way to think about it. I think before you're going to see some sort of safety coordination emerge between Anthropic and OpenAI and DeepMind or DeepSeek, never mind, you'd have to have a lot of discussions and a lot of word commits before you see any kind of real policy or economic commits in the direction of maybe reducing AGI risk. So his notion that governance need to connect, international bodies like the UN need to connect, sort of industry organizations. I think about stuff like the IEEE, for example. Wi-Fi standards are universal. We don't think of it as governance, but it's kind of a way that like stability is maintained. This patchwork approach and thinking about how to work within that patchwork and kind of have the setup of almost checks and balances and each party sort of working on where their respective strength is as we bubble up this thing that might be more powerful than people. It feels like that would be the only way it would work if it could work. Could it work? I don't know. I think we're going to find out as a species, but I agree with a lot of what Dean Xue Lan said there. I certainly hope to have a lot of other smart folks from across the pond on the show into the future, and I hope you enjoyed this episode with Dean Xue Lan. So in our next episode, we're going to dive in a little bit deeper into the international coordination side of things. Here's a little teaser for the next episode, which is also in the AI Governance series. Putting together international coordination to prevent the transfer and use of chemical weapons was a process that, we could say, quote unquote, successfully happened within the United Nations sort of ecosystem. We have someone from deep within that ecosystem who is involved with those chemical weapons regulations and coordination, speaking to us about what's different and what's the same about AGI, which is a bit of a different animal, but there's a lot to learn from other efforts to internationally coordinate, at least from the United Nations level. So some deep insights on that in the next episode. Hope you'll catch us right here on The Trajectory next Friday.